So it was under James I that the English settlement of what would become the 13 colonies and the first 13 United States began. James, of course, was in charge when Virginia was founded, hence Jamestown. And he was the dread sovereign lord mentioned in the Mayflower Compact at Plymouth Colony. Although there were Catholics at Jamestown, but they were crypto-Catholics, and for a very good reason. Catholicism was being heavily persecuted in England under James as it had been under Elizabeth, despite the religion of his wife. Part of the reason for this was the famous attempt to blow up Parliament by a Catholic named Guy Fawkes. There's an old joke, of course, that Guy Fawkes was the last man to enter Parliament with an honest intention. But regardless, Guy Fawkes Day has been remembered ever since and was a very anti-Catholic holiday for a lot of its existence. A number of priests were martyred under the rule of James I. And all in all, you can't say too much about him being very friendly to the Catholic Church, to say the least. But his older son, who had been very much like his father in religious opinions, died before James did. And so young Charles became the heir. And Charles was an interesting fellow indeed. He was heavily influenced by his mother and wanted to Catholicize the Church of England. This would be a goal that would come to people over and over again from that time to this. Charles had as much success and failed as spectacularly as anyone. After his father died, he began negotiations for reunion with the Holy See. In the end, for reasons that become obvious, they didn't go very far. He had inherited from his father a number of priests in prison in London. Well, he did a very strange thing. He allowed them to go out during the day to visit their flocks and come home and sleep in the prison at night. So that lasted for quite a long time, because he soon found that Parliament had become dominated by an oligarchy, a very heavily puritanical Calvinist oligarchy, whose grandfathers and great uncles had been the people who were given monastery lands by Henry VIII. And this had the unexpected side effect, the collateral damage, if you will, of building up an oligarchy, a powerful minority that wanted to rule the country themselves rather than the king. So they soon dominated Parliament, and in order to avoid dealing with them, the king dismissed Parliament, and he reigned without them for a good 10 years. The King's Peace, it was called. During that time, for the most part, Catholics were unmolested. He married a French princess, Henriette Marie, who was Catholic, and who made a pilgrimage to Tyburn Tree, where so many Catholic martyrs were killed under Elizabeth and James I. But this pleasant period didn't last long, unfortunately, because as part of his Catholicization policy, having put in an Archbishop of Canterbury who agreed with him, and who incidentally was twice offered the red hat by the Pope, he laughingly refused it. But the interesting thing about that story is that he couldn't have gotten the offer if Charles hadn't got along with it. Anyway, he attempted, Charles did, to impose a more Catholic-esque liturgy on the Church of Scotland. And they immediately took over the country. They demanded the execution of his closest co-workers, including Archbishop Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury I mentioned, and of course sent the Catholic priests who had been in the prisons in London off to the gallows. In response, the king declared war, and the result was the English Civil War, which was the first of what are called today the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, because they were fought in England, Ireland, and Scotland simultaneously. The king's supporters in all three kingdoms included all the Catholics, the High Church Anglicans, and were together called Cavaliers or Royalists. And from them, we get all sorts of interesting things, the Cavalier poets and so on. Unfortunately, militarily, they ended up not being a match for the man who came to lead Parliament's army, a man called Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a very unpleasant man, quite the bloody-handed murderer, to be honest. He would demonstrate this fighting in England and Scotland and Ireland. The Irish he treated miserably. And he engineered, after the king's forces were defeated in 1645, the king spent a couple of years in prison. And Oliver Cromwell engineered a show trial, and the king, having refused to give up bishops in the Church of England and being charged with, amongst other things, negotiating with Rome for reunion, he was duly murdered on the January the 30th, 1649, because of his refusal to give up the bishops in the Church of England, which would have saved his life. Many Anglicans consider him a martyr. Some few Catholics do as well, because of his interest in Catholicism. But regardless of that, he was gone. His oldest son, Charles II, attempted to regain his father's thrones and was defeated, fled the country, and there began 10 years of what was called the Protectorate, a terrible dictatorship under Cromwell. In the New World, where Virginia, Maryland, which had been founded as a Catholic refuge, and several other New England colonies have been settled, the Civil War was received rather differently in the two places. New England was happy to hear the news of the king's murder and to go along with their co-religionist Cromwell. But they had to send a fleet to subdue Virginia and Maryland. And in fact, the last battle of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms was fought not in England, Scotland, or Ireland, but at Severn Creek, Maryland. At any rate, 10 years of the Protectorate, Cromwell dies, and Charles II is recalled from exile. And then begins that period called the Restoration. Well, the king marries another Catholic princess, Catherine of Braganza. We're seeing this as a regular thing with Stuarts now. Not Catholics themselves, they marry Catholics. But then Charles II's brother James, who, after Charles and his wife fail to produce an heir, becomes the heir to the throne. He and his wife, Anne, convert to Catholicism together. But their two daughters do not, Mary and Anne. Mary is married to James's nephew, William of Orange, first cousins. So Charles manages to keep things going through the 1670s. He dies in 1685 after having had a showdown with Parliament about his brother becoming king. He converts to Catholicism on his deathbed, and interestingly enough, the priest who converted him, who received him into the church, was the one who had saved his life during the Civil Wars. He dies, his brother James becomes king. With papal approval, James becomes the head of the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, and he is crowned in an Anglican ceremony, very similar to what we're going to see in May. He rules for a few years. He marries, after his first wife dies, he marries an Italian princess, Mary of Modena. And the oligarchy, who could deal with Charles, they were willing to deal with James so long as his heiresses were the Protestant Mary and Anne. But then in 1688, his wife, Mary of Modena, has a son, James, the Prince of Wales. The oligarchy called William of Orange over. There is a short, brief skirmish in England. James flees the country after the Duke of Marlborough goes over to the invader with his army. There's a big fight in Scotland. But unfortunately, although James's supporters won there, their commander, the famous Bonnie Dundee, was killed there at the Battle of Killiecrankie, and so the cause in Scotland went down. It was in Ireland where the biggest struggle would take place. James II returned to Ireland to lead the troops in 1690, and William of Orange crossed over from England. The result was a battle called the Boyne, in which James was defeated, and he fled the country again. After a couple of years, his allies in Ireland were defeated. What's interesting about that, though, was that James was the ally of Louis XIV of France, who at the time was on the outs with the Pope. The Pope, on the other hand, was the ally of William of Orange, and a large part of William's troops at the Battle of the Boyne were Catholic. And when the news came that James had been defeated at the Boyne, the Pope sang the Te Deum. That is something that will probably not please either Orangemen or Catholics in Ireland. But that's the way history is, ladies and gentlemen. It very often doesn't make anybody look good.